Kwe. This is Stephen Nojiri, and this video is in response to a request that was made of me. So, what I'm going to talk about now is I'm going to talk about military tactic institutions in the 1600s. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with a few sort of disclaimers and a few little notes. And then I'm going to talk about the five major institutions. Now, I know you guys like to say schools all the time, but I'm trying to differentiate the English to give you guys a better idea of what we're actually talking about. So the five major institutions. Then we're going to talk about the big institutions that aren't the five major. We'll discuss that. Then I'm going to just give you a little bit of a lesson that comes from one of the Kusunoki documents, from one of the third wave documents that describes and criticizes five different types of schools. And then we're going to talk about another sort of military tradition that just doesn't get discussed much. And hopefully by the end of the video, it will make sense, you will have a better understanding, and you'll see a little bit better how things are interconnected. So the very first thing that I want to do is I want to put a disclaimer on here. There's going to be information in this video that some of you guys may find aggravating, because I'm going to say some things that might shatter some ideas that some of you have. And I'm sorry, but that's just, I'm in this video, I'm going to give you this just straight up history. And if you don't like it, I apologize. For example, one of the things I'm going to tell you guys is that Yoshitsune Ryu does not come before the 1650s. So I know a lot of people right now, I know are going to be, no, that's bullshit. I'm sorry, guys. Nope. Yoshitsune Ryu does not go back that far. It was created in the late 1600s, and I'll explain. But before I do that, I just want to let you guys know that if you're offended by anything in the video, that's your burden to bear. The other thing also before I start is these institutions that I'm going to talk about, you didn't have to study them for life. It wasn't like you started studying it as a teenager and studied it until your 60s and then only got the deep secrets when you were in your 60s. That is a fairy tale. That is a myth. That is a major misconception. Essentially, within the first 3 years, by year 3, you would get your first certificate. Then by year 5 or 7, you would probably get your instructor certificate. Then somewhere between around year 10, 11, 12, you would get your secret transmissions. And then, so basically between 10 to 15 years, you would receive the full transmission. You would have an instructor certificate, you would have received secret teachings, and you could literally just go off and be a teacher of that tradition yourself. 10 to 15 years. There are some people that did this 2 or 3 times in their life, so they held instructor permissions and secret teachings for 2 to 3 different schools. Some people may have even had, full transmission in 2 traditions and partial transmissions in a couple traditions. It is not like one person only ever studied one system for 50 years. That is not how it works. That is not how it happened. All right, now with that having been said, let's talk about the 5 major institutions of the Edo period. First and foremost, we have to say Koshu-ryu. Koshu-ryu is the pinnacle institution is the pinnacle tactical system of tactics. The Heigaku, Gungaku system is Koshu-ryu. All of these 5 main institutions all come from Koshu-ryu. So Koshu-ryu is sometimes incorrectly attributed to Takeda Shingen, as I've mentioned many times. That's false. Koshu-ryu starts with, and only with, Obata Kagenori. Now, Obata Kagenori is born into his family, right? His dad is an Obata, and he's there, and they are Takeda retainers. But he's born right at the end of the Takeda clan in the mid 1570s. he really, when he enters into his young adulthood, which remember in samurai times, young adulthood's not 19, 20, it's like 11, 12, 13, you know what I mean? So when his teen years come in, he's a Tokugawa retainer. So he's a retainer for Tokugawa, but he knows and he's connected to all of the ex Takeda retainers who became Tokugawa retainers. And so he goes around and he collects stories and techniques from the Takeda retainers. This is not Takeda Shingen's teachings. Some of the teachings are from Takeda, yes, but they're not from Takeda himself. They're coming through the retainers. So there's not a direct line from Takeda to Obata. Obata's picking up information that he's getting from uncles and friends of uncles and cousins. Da da da. He's getting this information from people that are related to him through the previous service to Takeda, but now they're all Tokugawa retainers. He does this until he's in his mid 20s, 24, 25, something like that, and then he requests to be released from service and becomes a Ronin by choice. He then, at this point, sort of falls off the map a little bit. We're not entirely sure what he does. He wanders. He maybe takes mercenary contracts. We're not sure. But we do know that he's also still collecting tactics and techniques and things like that. This goes on until the siege of Osaka, where he ends up catching a little bit before the siege of Osaka. He comes back into the light, so to speak, and he ends and he's in, somehow it's unclear, but somehow he's known as being at this point like a mercenary. He's hired by the Tokugawa to spy, to do an intel espionage operation, to spy on Osaka Castle. And it goes so good that afterwards he's assessed as being a brilliant tactician, and he has this massive amount of Heigaku. He is then hired by the Tokugawa as a tactician and a schoolmaster, and this is where Koshuru really begins. Now, Koshuru, as most people know, has a lot of stuff that comes from the days of the Takeda retainers, but it really has a ridiculous amount of what's basically called Gunbai Shiso, which is essentially yin yang, 5 elements, divination, good days, bad days, which direction, blah, blah, blah. At this time, lots of people really are attracted to Confucianism, Taoism, and they really like a lot of this yin yang, 5 elements, good days, good luck, bad luck. So Obata puts all of the divination material at the end of the course. And there's a lot of people that study all the history of the Takeda retainers and all of these military methods just so that they can get to the divination and all the yin yang stuff at the end of the course, so to speak. So Koshuru is a bunch of history and a bunch of tactics. And then for the secret transmission, you have all the yin yang, 5 elements, divination, good days, bad days, directions, all that stuff. From Koshuru, the 4 other schools, the 4 other main institutions come out of it. So one of Obata's main students is Hojo Ujinaga. So Hojo Ujinaga is a very, very devout Koshuru student. He even writes many documents for Koshuru. But something happens and he ends up making Hojo-ryu, or the Hojo institution, so to speak. So this becomes this is the second main institution, Hojo system. So you have Koshu and then you have Hojo. Hojo is basically Koshuru with a lot of the divination and magic removed, and a synthesis of Kusunoki Ryu ideology into the system. So what basically happened is in the 1630s, Hojo Ujinaga, you can see when he's writing documents, you see initially his documents are very Koshuru, very, very Koshuru-like. But we know that he's influenced by Kusunoki Ryu, and he actually seems to take a liking to some of the concepts of Kusunoki Ryu. And Kusunoki Ryu is pretty much in opposition to Koshuru and a lot of its ideology. So we see a shift in Hojo Ujinaga's mind, and he stops becoming so hardline Koshu, and he starts really thinking in a way that blends Kusunoki and Koshu. We also see that his writings at this time, so his writings from the mid 1630s on, he really starts dropping a lot of the divination and magic, and he starts changing some of his ideological approaches to things. We can see this in a lot of the documents that he submits to the Tokugawa shogun. You can watch over the years, you can see how his thinking and style changes, and it becomes inevitable that he creates the Hojo Ryu institution as a result of that. The next one of the main five is Yamaga Ryu, or the institution created by Yamaga Sogo. So we won't go too much into that. It's very big, it's very complex, but essentially Yamaga Sogo is a Koshuru Hojo Ryu student. It's interesting though, because in Yamaga's documents, he lists the lineage basically as Yamamoto Kansuke down to Hayakawa Yukitoyo, who's actually from the house of Ie, then to Obata Kagenori. So, but we know it's very interesting. So what's possible, theoretically possible, based on the Yamago documents, is that when Obata disappeared for all those years, maybe, perhaps, something, he studied under Hayakawa Yukitoyo. But I don't know. I haven't researched that much. All I know is that Yamaga Sogo's charts state Yamamoto, Hayakawa, Obata, Hojo, and then Yamaga himself. So that deserves a little bit more investigation. But I know that that's been investigated by military scholars already. But I haven't looked into it too much. But the point is that Hojo Ryu and Yamaga Ryu are branched out of Hojo Ryu, but they all have slightly different explanations. The next one, which is kind of a branch with its own flavors, Echigo Ryu. So the Echigo institution, started by Sawazaki Kagezane. And there's a PDF floating around the internet somewhere that has like a lot of their stuff in it, so you can sort of see, it's again military tactics, history of like Takeda clan, and a whole bunch of kind of yin yang magic stuff, etc., etc. So we won't go into that too much, but it's one of the major systems. Then you have the Naganuma Ryu, which is the Naganuma institution, started by Naganuma Muneyoshi. And it is probably the school or the institution that's most closest to what you would think of as Western style military techniques. There's rank and file drills. So it's about rank and file marching and moving as rank and file units and shooting as units. And it's very, very much like for its time, it stood out considerably because it's based on the Koshuru ideas, but it really approaches it like a modern Western military. And because of that, it actually lasted fairly late into the Edo period, because if you guys know, even before the Meiji Restoration, if you guys know your history, you know that the Tokugawa shogunate had already opened the country and was already being very influenced by Westerners. If you know your history, you know that the Tokugawa shogun was actually the pro-Western faction, and that the Meiji government was initially the anti-Western faction. It wasn't until after the Restoration that the Meiji government flipped and became pro-Western. So if you guys didn't know that, there you go. You need to learn that. That's an important fact to know. So before the Meiji Restoration, when the Tokugawa shogun was open to Westerners and bringing in all kinds of Western ideas, at that point, the Naganuma Ryu did very well because it already had this rank and file approach. So again, but then even though the Naganuma had this very rank and file approach, still behind the scenes, it had yin yang, five elements, divination, that gunbai shiso, which is again, it just everybody wanted it, so it was like the carrot dangled to the student. You know, if you do your homework, if you learn battle formations, if you learn proper this, proper that, we'll teach you how to pick the right direction. Blah blah blah. So it's the carrot dangled in front of them, so to speak. Now, and before I move on, I do want to say that the certificate, there are certificates being awarded in these systems even into the 1860s. So these systems start in the 1600s and they just continue into the late 1800s. So these five systems dominate the Heigaku of the samurai of the Edo period. So now that we've discussed the main five, let's discuss some important ones that did not last long. And we'll explain why they have. I'm going to pick three of them and I'll explain why they didn't last long. The first one that I want to discuss is Yoshitsune Ryu, the institution of Yoshitsune. That was started by an individual named Ihara Yorifumi. And I don't know his birth date. I know he died in 1686. His birth date's somewhere around 1610, 11, 12, somewhere in there. He died in 1686 and he's not 86 years old. He's in his 70s. So let's just say 1610. Let's say 1610 to 1686. So this guy, Ihara Yorifumi. This is the man who started Yoshitsune Ryu. Prior to Ihara sensei, there's no Yoshitsune Ryu. Ihara Yorifumi does have a small connection to the Kusunoki Fuden teachings. It's not big, but it's small, but it's there. But basically, he has a great deep respect for Yoshitsune. He also has some teachings from like Kusunoki Fuden, et cetera, et cetera. He's hired in the Fukui domain as a tactician, and there he starts Yoshitsune Ryu, or the institution for Yoshitsune. But it does not last long. It doesn't make it to the 1700s. It as a formal institution, it does die off quickly. In comparison to the five schools, it dies off quickly. You still have some people keeping the flame of it alive through the 1700s and the 1800s, but for the most part, it's only like aspects of the school stay alive. The institution closes, is gone. For example, like, and so I'll give you an example. Like, there's a guy named Ando Sensei, who is a Kusunoki Ryu instructor, but he also, so Ihara Yorifumi studies with Kusunoki Fuden, then Ando Sensei, who's a Kusunoki student, goes and studies with Ihara Sensei after Yoshitsune Ryu is really, there. And so you get some interesting writings coming from Ando Sensei because they have Kusunoki and Yoshitsune. Both of the systems are sort of in his writings. It's very good material, actually. So since we've talked about, and so I've made an entire video on Kusunoki, so I'm only going to talk briefly about it here. You can watch the other videos. But in Kusunoki, you have the Kusunoki tradition that predates the 1600s, but in the 1600s, you get one institution based on the Taiheki commentaries and a little bit of the Kusunoki tradition. One system that gets based on the Kusunoki tradition as it came through one of the branch lines. Then you get the Kusunoki tradition that is from the actual family, but it never forms an institution. So it doesn't really count in this particular dynamic. The one that counts the most, the key one, is the institution formed by Kusunoki Fuden. Kusunoki Ryu Gungaku, also known as Nankiryu, or some people say Nanbokuryu, that is the one that really counts. That's the main one. With the other two, the one based on the commentaries and the one based on the alternate tradition, so to speak, the alternate line, families that were related to Kusunoki, but they're not the Kusunoki family. Their line is over in the east. So from the from these, the main one is Kusunoki Fuden. That tradition is strong. The Kusunoki Fuden institution rivals Koshuru, the Koshu institution. And if the master, so the headmaster, the leader of the institution is named in 1651 is named Yui Shosetsu, and he leads a rebellion that doesn't work, and the school collapses. If that didn't happen, Kusunoki Ryu Gungaku, Kusunoki Ryu Heigaku would continue to rival Koshuru and may have even existed just like Koshuru into the late 1800s, but the school crumbles when the rebellion takes place and fails. So Yoshitsune Ryu sort of fizzles out because it just doesn't get enough support. Kusunoki Ryu, the Kusunoki institution, had ridiculous support, but because of the failed rebellion, it can't stay open. Then there's other traditions like Kamizumi Ryu Heigaku. Now a lot of you guys will go, "Oh, Kamizumi, I know that." No, before you get all sword fighter on me, I'm not talking about the Kamizumi sword fighting. I'm talking about the Kamizumi Heigaku. That institution starts and it actually has a lot of magic and a lot of divination in it. Again, not the sword fighting stuff, the Heigaku. The problem with Kamizumi Heigaku, though, is that it competes against Koshuru, Hojoru, Yamagaru. It competes against these other schools and it becomes marginalized. And the Kamizumi Heigaku just disappears. It fizzles out because it's marginalized by the competition. Okay, so that should give you an idea of the 5 major schools. That should also give you an idea of these other sort of schools that you hear about and most people don't know where they fit into the picture. You also, so with all this said, you say, well, are there more schools in this? Yes, there are more institutions. You have countless family traditions and you have countless minor schools that might open for one generation and then close. There's so many little branches and somebody might study a system and get the first 2 certificates. They'll get the first certificate and they'll get the instructor certificate, but they won't finish out for the full certificate, but they may branch off and make their own school so they may go to 2 or 3 different schools within 10 years and then make their own family tradition over here, things like that. That's really difficult to track because there's so many of them. There's easily 100 little tiny ones that pop up here and there that don't really go anywhere. They sort of pretty much stay within a particular clan, a particular family. So there's a lot of traditions. Now I'm going to be very careful when I say this. There's a lot of traditions that claim to predate the 1600s, but are absolutely proven to start in the late 1600s. And they're almost always based off of either one of the 5 main institutions, or Kamizumi, or Kusunoki, or Yoshitsune. So those 8, the 5 major and those 3 short-lived, many traditions actually come from those 8 in the late 1600s. But I won't go into that. I won't continue on that. I'll just let that simmer for a while. The next thing that I want to talk about now is I'm going to give you guys a teaching that comes from a text called Kusunoki Ryu, very simple name for a text. It is 35 volumes long. And I'm going to give you a teaching from one of the volumes called Gunho Hyoron, which basically means a critical evaluation of military methods. This teaching is so this is from the third wave of Kusunoki. This is from the Kusunoki Fuden institution. And so that means it is definitely written in the 1600s, and it doesn't try to pretend not to be. You'll see what I'm going to say in a moment. It is a criticism of five types of schools. So this will give you an idea that in the 1600s, schools weren't pretending like everything was from the past. They know their traditions. It's us in the 1900s and 2000 who've screwed up the history. They knew their timelines, and they also in a lot of the writing that's coming from these guys, the writing is contemporary. They write they have a lot of writing about what's going on at the time. So like this text, the Gunho Hyoron, is written about other schools at the time. So the first criticism is a criticism of schools of ancient traditions that have lost the meaning of those traditions. They use a lot of magic, such as talismans, and they have a large focus on tools, weapons, and armor. This criticizes much of the family traditions or the traditions of the house of so-and-so or the house of so-and-so. And the criticism is that they have magic that's passed down. They have a list of tools and diagrams that are passed down, but they themselves don't even really know how to use it that well, and they don't know the context for a lot of it. But they pass it down and they teach it, but they don't really know what it is they're doing. That's the criticism. The second type of school, the second criticism, schools that focus on misunderstandings of ancient classics such as the Six Secret Teachings and focus heavily on chi clouds. So this criticizes a lot of different schools that basically don't teach anything other than the shape of chi clouds, things like that. Now, it's okay to have a system that teaches chi clouds, but there are some systems that teach nothing but chi clouds. That's pretty much all they teach. So this is a criticism of that. The third criticism criticizes Koshu Ryu, or the Koshu institution, directly, calls it out directly. The Koshu-ryu and all the other schools that root from the Koyo Gunkan. So basically, this third criticism goes to the five main institutions. He says they pick and choose things they like, and they make military methods from quotes they've gathered. So the accusation is that they have brought together a whole bunch of different materials and quotes and stories and history but that there isn't a coherent tradition there. There's an amalgamation. And you did see this, even now this text is written before Fujibayashi writes the Bunsen Shukai, but even Fujibayashi's Bunsen Shukai would technically fall under this criticism, because the idea is that there isn't a tradition there. It's more like it's just been made up from a bunch of pieces pulled together. So that's the third criticism. The fourth criticism is criticizing schools that rely solely on ancient documents such as the Hijitsu Ikansho. They focus only on magic, spells, and talismans, and they lack any actual warrior techniques or military techniques, army techniques. They don't have any actual warfare techniques. The schools are nothing but magic. So that there's some schools that there are some ancient documents that are called war manuals, but they only have magic in them. Some of the oldest war manuals in Japan are actually nothing but magic. But there are schools in the Edo period, in the early Edo period. So this text is before 1650. There are some schools that are popping up at the time that teach nothing but magic, no military techniques whatsoever. And so that criticism goes to those. The fifth criticism goes to the other Kusunoki institutions who focus too hard on the Taiheki commentaries and don't have the correct understanding of Kusunoki's tradition. So that one could be seen, that one's pretty clear, right? So the Kusunoki Fuden tradition is saying, hey, these other two institutions that have the name Kusunoki, they don't correctly understand Kusunoki, and they focus too much. They rely too much on just the commentaries to the Taiheki. So that's the fifth criticism. So by introducing this teaching to you, this Gunho Hyoron from Kusunoki Ryu, you can, the institution, the third wave institution, hopefully that helps you to get a better understanding of how these schools are developing, how they're existing, and how they are sort of even criticizing each other. Okay, so the last thing that I want to discuss is Imperial Heigaku. So we've talked about all of these other things, family traditions, we've talked about institutions. Let's talk about militarized Shinto. So, as some of you know, well, I'll explain it. For those that don't know, I'll explain it. There's not just Shinto. You have different styles of Shinto, different types of Shinto. You have like Yoshida Shinto, you have Nakatomi Shinto, you have Mononobe Shinto. There's so many different types of Shinto. You have specific styles of Shinto, so to speak. Some of those styles of Shinto have military teachings in them. So that is another thing that's happening at the time. So these military styles, these Shinto styles with military teachings are also coming down through the centuries as well. In the Edo period, some small institutions pop up based on these Shinto military traditions, divine military traditions, or military traditions of the gods. The word is Shingunden, right? Divine or God military tradition. But some of these traditions, some of these forms of Shinto go back to either an emperor or a prince or a retired emperor. Those ones, when you have the kanji for kami, for God, it's actually Jingunden, and it refers to it being from the imperial line. So because again, let me explain to some of you who don't know, when you see the kanji for kami, usually it means divine or gods or something like that. But in certain circumstances, it refers specifically to the divinity of the imperial house. So in this particular case, so if it doesn't trace back to an imperial house, then it's Shingunden and it is a divine military tradition. But if it traces back to a prince or an emperor or a retired emperor, if it traces back to the imperial house at all, it's Jingunden, which is an divine imperial or imperial military tradition. Though some of those in the Edo period, some of those briefly pop up with their own institutions. When they pop up, some of them stay Heigaku. Some of them start adapting swordsmanship and archery and the school becomes an archery and sword school, and the Heigaku falls back to the secret instructions. For example, the Tachibana, so there's what's called the Tachibana Shingunden, which is a type of Shinto that a type of militarized Shinto that then brought in archery and swordsmanship in the 1600s, and the school became an it was originally a Heigaku school, but then it became an archery and a sword school, and then you learned the Heigaku after, at the stage of sort of like the secret instruction stage. There's also a system for there. Another one of those is Tadaru or the Tada Shingunden, which comes from Minamoto Mitsunaka. Sorry, guys, my brain. I had to think for a moment. Minamoto Mitsunaka is the alleged origin of the Tada Shingunden. Now, whether that's true or not, I'd have to research it, extensively. But that's what the school says. So one, and there's also and I won't go into the details now, but there is the, this is an important thing. So you guys can clock this now because I'm going to be bringing this up later, but clock it now. This idea of these imperial military traditions. But one interesting thing, in not every one of the military their shingun, but in a lot of them, you will see the theme of the emperor is the sun and the retainers are the stars of the Big Dipper. And this is a theme that runs through most of them. That, along with the Big Dipper Taoist Chinese divination stuff found in the five main schools, led to a massive surgence in this idea of Big Dipper magic. Now, there's always been Big Dipper magic in Japan, but it became super popular at the end of the 1600s with some of these schools having spells based on the Big Dippers, and then these Shingunden systems opened up, and they had Big Dipper magic, and it was in the Taoist traditions, it doesn't really matter the emperor, but in the Shingunden traditions, it was connected to the imperial house and stuff. So you will find the Big Dipper starts coming up a lot in certain parts of the country, not all over the country, but certain parts of the country. This idea of the sun and the Big Dipper it becomes very strong because you have one of the five main schools is there, plus you have some small Shingunden system usually teaching archery and some form of Shinto, and then there's the stars of the Big Dippers there too. So it creates pockets around the country of intense interest in Big Dipper stuff. Okay, so hopefully this has been helpful for you. So a quick recap. In the Edo period, you had five main institutions, and they all pretty much come from Koshuru, the Koshu institution. Each one of them does have their own distinct flavor. For example, Hojoru is like a mixture of Kusunoki and Koshu. Yamagaru is, it's not Koshu. They all have their unique styling, but they're all pretty much the child of Koshu. Then, rivaling Koshu, you have the Kusunoki institution, and that's got things is associated with other institutions such like Yoshitsune, etc., etc. But because of the failed Kiin rebellion or Kiin revolt in 1651, the school closes, and when the Kusunoki institution closes, that's it. I mean, you can't Koshu institution pretty much then dominates after that because there's no rival, there's no competition really. The other schools are their own schools, but they're like the child. They can't ever really compete, right? So this is why Koshu and these other institutions last until the 1860s. Like I said, certificates are still being given in the 1860s for these schools. I have also shown, I've given you one of the teachings from the Kusunoki, right? The criticism of the 5 types of incorrect schools. And I've also told you about the Shingunden. So hopefully, with all of this, you have an idea, a better idea of how this really took place and where everything fits into here. And like I said, within this, so within this structure that I've explained to you, which is I've focused on the 1600s, within this structure, you pretty much have Koshu and Kusunoki, and they start to have children traditions, so to speak, branching out of them starting in the 1630s, 1640s. You see a surgence of several minor traditions popping up in the later 1600s, 1660, 1670, 1680, 1690. For example, Fujibayashi Sensei writes the Bansen Shukai in the late 1600s. So he's studied and been influenced by these other institutions. He pulls a bunch of stuff together. He creates his own tradition. You see that a lot in the later 1600s. There are a lot of traditions that pop up in the late 1600s that claim to be ancient, and they make the claim based on the history they connect to and the feeling and their ideas, but really, forensically speaking, the school is only from the late 1600s, but they oftentimes claim ancient ancestors, etc., etc., etc. But the institution does not exist prior to the late 1600s. So hopefully this clarifies things and people have a better understanding